Hi Paul, thanks for the footage. And just before we go on to the sort of main area of concern, which would be for you going forward, your delivery into the impact area, so from about P6, shaft parallel with the ground, what I'd like to do is just go over the setup, or certainly from setup P1 to the top of your backswing, just to give you some guidance. Doing a pretty good job considering you're new to the system and just returning to playing some golf. So just some key areas to focus on in regards to tidying up the overall setup position, and then you'll move to the top of the backswing. So you can see here on the right I've put Aaron Badley. Centre of the arc is the red dot. The radius formed by the left arm and the golf club is in a relatively straight line. There's usually a little bit of a forward press before most players start going from there, but certainly not as kinked as with yourself. So too much angle between the lead arm and the shaft. So key number one for you at P1 is to feel like you're going to push the handle forward so that you line up your lead arm and the shaft in a slightly more appropriate manner. When you're setting up as per Aaron is here, with the shaft leaning forward, you're establishing a swing direction that is, I'll just get rid of that line again for you, a little bit more out to the right, and an angle of attack that is a little bit more downward. So you're establishing that at address. So the centre of the arc is the lead shoulder. The left arm and club form a radius coming out of the centre of the arc, and then the position of the lead arm relative to the centre of the arc creates a certain angle of attack or swing direction at setup. So if the shaft is, so if the ball is too far forward and the shaft is leaning back, the player is hitting more up and across. And if the ball is well back and the player is hitting down, he's hitting more outward, and the swing is directed more out to the right. Things can then change in your swing, obviously, but we want to try and establish as much good stuff at P1 as we can. So handle forward, creating a little bit more straight line between the lead arm and the club. And as a general rule, feel like the shaft is going to point towards the centre of the lead hip. So I like your ball position, I like your weight location. I'd just like to see your handle push forward a little bit more for the reasons described. Now then, what we're looking for from P1 to P4 is to keep the centre of the shoulder turn and the centre of the pelvis relatively stable. In order to do that, the lead shoulder has to work down. The player is extending, rotating and side bending incrementally. So the knees are changing flex throughout the time and space of the backswing in a gradual manner. You can see there when Aaron does that, lead shoulder's downward trajectory, that's the side bend going in. He's also extending, which is allowing him to rotate more, which is keeping the head in the box and the pelvis, centre at least, relatively stable. In your instance, what we do is we work the left shoulder down too fast. We change flex in the knees too much too soon. And consequently, early in the piece, the head goes down and forward, so there's excessive side bend. Then as we rotate, we sort of almost recenter with the upper body, but you can see the pelvis has gone way too far forward during the backswing. And that leads to problems, certainly during the transition, but mostly, most importantly, throughout the downswing. So too much of a good thing. So the left shoulder should work down, the knees should change flex, but you do too much too soon. So to help you with that, I'm just going to get rid of these lines now. What I'd like you to do is, when you're practicing, put a club or an alignment cane in the centre of your stance. Now at setup, particularly with a sort of a shortish mid-iron, the centre of the pelvis and the centre of the shoulder turn should be just fractionally in front of the centre of your stance. Now, during your backswing, you should feel like you stay over that club rather than moving further in front of it. So during the stack and tilt swing, we're not looking to move forward during the backswing. We're looking to stay stable. Centre of the shoulder turn, centre of the pelvis, just ever so slightly out in front of the centre of the stance. Now, the position of the two centres relative to the centre of the stance may change from player to player. I'd advise a beginning golfer to have both a little bit further forward, because that's going to help with low point and also creating a slightly bigger turn whilst learning to hit out at the golf ball a little bit more. But you can see during the backswing, we want to try and stay stable, not move forward. We're forward at P1 and we stay forward P1 to P4. So that's your setup to backswing work. Handle forward to create a slightly more descending angle of attack and outward swing direction. Then learn to turn, extend and side bend at an incremental rate so as to stabilise the upper centre. So as we transition, what we need to do now in order to progress quickly in regards to you entry back into the game is we need to control the location of the weight. So we need to keep the weight forward and progressively move forward during the downswing whilst controlling the radius of the swing. So by the time the shaft gets parallel to the ground in the downswing, some key points to consider here are the position of the lead arm, the position of the butt of the golf club in relation to the golf ball, and the angle formed by the wrists. So what Aaron's doing here in transition from P4 to P6 is moving the weight forward whilst controlling the radius of the swing. When that's done correctly, the butt of the club would arrive at the mid-trail thigh and the shaft will still be at around about 75 degrees of hinge in relation to the trail arm. So pelvis has moved forward whilst rotating. Left arm has started to move away from the trail shoulder. Right arm is straightening out, but the wrist angles have been maintained. And that means that the radius of the swing, which we established at address, has been kept tight in order to then release into impact. So that sort of relationship between the lead arm changes slightly because we've got some hip slides, so we can keep the angle in the back of the trail wrist. So here, to prevent the club bottoming out behind the ball. But generally speaking, leave wrist flat, radius recovered, weight move forward. So the key point here is at P6, we want the butt of the club to be more in line with the golf ball, and we want the hands to be encroaching onto the trail leg by the time the shaft gets parallel with the ground. So that's very important. That can happen and the shaft be much further on in the downswing. It can also happen and it be very early in the downswing. So if we look at your action here now from the top of the backswing, the weight's gone too far forward at the top. We discussed that earlier. Now it sort of stays where it is, can't really move any further forward. So that makes it difficult to do what Aaron's just done in transition. And you can see that that lead arm doesn't move away from the trail shoulder quick enough. And the wrist angles come out far too quick. We sort of just missed P6 here, but we can sort of guesstimate that based on that footage, your P6 will be happening here. It will be too high up and the butt of the club, just do that line again, I beg your pardon, the butt of the club is too far behind the ball. So once you've tidied the setup, what I'd like you to focus on doing, and you need to rehearse this pre-shot and then try and execute a shot whilst letting this sort of drip feed its way into your game. So don't try and force the issue when you're actually hitting balls. But before each shot, I want you to swing to P4 and stop. Then I want to bring your arms down so that the hands or the butt of the club are in line with the belt buckle by the time the shaft gets parallel with the ground. Now what that means is that you're going to have to speed up your left arm, redirect your right arm, and maintain the angles in your wrist to achieve that. But the checkpoint is still the same. So from P4, you're going to put the butt of the club or the hands in line with the buckle on the belt by the time the shaft gets parallel with the ground. That means that the radius of your swing is going to be much tighter than where it would normally be. The wider the arc, the lower the club is travelling to the ground, and the more likely you are to hit the ground behind the ball. To strike the ball consistently, the player has to control primarily the location of the body weight and the radius of the golf swing. So you can see there's a stark contrast between your position at P6 and Aaron's. It's going to be really interesting to watch this one pan out, because I'd like to see some footage in about a week's time after you've practiced this, just to see what other areas of the swing, particularly the through swing, start to tidy up. A really good way of adding some sort of detail to your practice would be to fold a golf towel up so that it sits about a grip's length behind the ball that you're hitting. Fold it up in a manner where it is around about the same sort of height as the golf ball would be, there or thereabouts. And then make some swings where you miss the towel on the way back, more importantly on the way down. So in order to miss the towel on the way down, as you start the transition, you're going to need to keep the weight moving forward, maintain the angles in the wrist. That means the only mechanism you're going to use for lowering the club is by creating some axis tilt, releasing the left arm away from the trail shoulder, redirecting the right arm. You can see the Aaron will come in over the top of that towel each time. If you want to see some footage of players doing that, there's quite a few people who I've worked with at the studio, hands-on lessons where we do that drill. If you're struggling to find the footage, let me know and I'll send you the link across. So just to recap, at setup, move the handle forward so that you create a much better radius. P1, handle more towards that position. P1 to P4, side bend at a more incremental rate, keeping the upper centre and lower centre just ahead of the centre of the stance, rather than having it move forward as you make the backswing. And from there you'll be in a much better position to move further forward during the downswing, whilst learning how to maintain the wrist angles as per the description. Speed up the left arm, redirect the right arm whilst holding on to the wrist